How resistance is quietly created. Hold this point steady as we begin. Most people believe they are disturbed by opposition, by pressure, by resistance coming from the outside. But this belief is already a judgment, and it is the source of the struggle you feel. Events themselves do not carry force. They arrive without opinion. What burdens you is not what happens, but what you decide it means. When you attempt to stand against resistance, you usually imagine an enemy, a person, a situation, a condition that must be overcome. Yet nothing external has the power to compel your inner posture. If resistance feels heavy, it is because you are leaning against your own judgment of it. You have already labeled it as an obstacle, an insult, or a threat. Stoic discipline begins by removing this confusion. There is no requirement to approve of events, but there is also no obligation to fight them internally. The moment you treat resistance as something that should not exist, you create tension. The moment you insist it must be different, you begin to strain. Responsibility cannot be shifted outward here. If disturbance appears, it has entered through assent. You allowed an impression to become a verdict. This is not a condemnation. It is a clarification. Because what enters through judgment can also be withheld through judgment. Standing without resistance does not mean collapsing or yielding. It means remaining upright without inner opposition. Calm is not passivity. It is accuracy. Notice this carefully, how authority is misplaced. Before discussing discipline, ownership must be precise. You cannot stand without resistance if you are unclear about what actually belongs to you. Most inner strain comes from misplacing authority. You assume responsibility for things that were never yours, and then feel frustrated when they do not obey. According to Stoic reasoning, there is a clean division. On one side are your judgments, intentions, choices, and responses. These are fully yours. They answer only to your reason. On the other side are events, other people's actions, outcomes, timing, recognition, and reputation. These do not answer to you. They never have. Resistance is created when these domains are confused. You try to command what is external, and then react emotionally when it refuses to comply. The effort itself is misplaced. No amount of discipline can make another person behave as you wish. No amount of resolve can guarantee outcomes. When discipline is applied to the wrong object, it turns into tension. Consider a simple situation. Someone speaks to you sharply. The words arrive. That is an event. It is not yet an insult. The insult appears only if you judge it as one. But instead of noticing this distinction, most people immediately attempt to control the other person's tone, intention, or respect. When that fails, resistance builds. Anger follows. Not because of the words, but because authority was claimed where none existed. Or consider delay. A plan does not unfold on time. You begin to resist the delay internally. You tell yourself it should not be happening. You imagine how things would be better if circumstances aligned differently. In that moment, you are not responding to reality. You are opposing it. The frustration you feel is not imposed by the delay. It is generated by your refusal to accept what was never under your control. Stoic discipline does not ask you to like events. It asks you to place responsibility correctly. You are accountable for how you interpret, not for how the world behaves. When this boundary is respected, effort becomes clean. When it is ignored, effort becomes strain. Standing without resistance does not mean withdrawing from action. You still speak when reason calls for it. You still act, plan, correct, and decide. The difference is internal. You act without demanding that reality cooperate emotionally. You do not tie your stability to outcomes. This is why Epictetus insisted that freedom begins with understanding what is and is not up to you. Not as an abstract idea, but as a daily operational rule. Each time you become disturbed, something has crossed the boundary. Either you tried to govern what is external, or you neglected what was internal. When authority is placed correctly, resistance loses its footing. You no longer argue with what happens. You address only what belongs to you, your judgment about it. This does not make life easier. It makes effort honest. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, where agreement quietly occurs. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Events do not strike the mind fully formed. They arrive first as impressions. A sound. A delay. A facial expression. A sentence spoken too quickly. These impressions are automatic. You do not invite them, and you cannot prevent them. They appear as part of being alive. What follows is not automatic. After the impression comes judgment. The mind interprets what has appeared. It tells a story about what the impression means. This story is where disturbance begins to take shape, but even here, nothing is final yet. The critical moment is assent. Assent is the point where you agree with the judgment. Where you say, silently or explicitly, yes, this is how it is. Once assent is given, the impression becomes a verdict. Emotion follows. Tension follows. Resistance follows. Not because of the event, but because you have authorized the interpretation. This sequence is precise: impression, judgment, assent, reaction. The mistake most people make is collapsing these steps into one. They say, I was angry because of what happened, without noticing that something intervened between the event and the anger. That intervening step is consent. Impressions arrive uninvited. Assent does not. Consider criticism. Someone comments on your work. The sound of their words is an impression. It carries no inherent meaning. The judgment might be, I am being disrespected, or they think I am incompetent. The moment you assent to that judgment, the body tightens. Resistance appears. You begin preparing arguments, defenses, or counterattacks. All of this happens after assent, not before it. Or consider misunderstanding. A message goes unanswered. The impression is absence. Silence. The judgment fills the gap, they are ignoring me, or I am being dismissed. If you assent to that judgment, irritation or anxiety follows. But if you withhold assent, the impression remains incomplete. It is just silence. Nothing more. Stoic discipline does not demand that you suppress impressions or feelings. Feeling irritation or surprise is not failure. The failure occurs only when feeling is mistaken for truth. When sensation is granted authority without examination. Between what happens and how you respond, there is a moment. It may be brief, but it exists. That moment is the only point of freedom you have. Not freedom over events, but freedom over agreement. Standing without resistance depends entirely on how you treat this moment. If you rush through it, you will always feel pushed by life. If you slow it down, even slightly, the structure becomes visible. You begin to see that you are not compelled to agree with every story your mind produces. This does not mean you replace judgments with positive ones. Stoicism is not optimism. It is accuracy. Sometimes the correct judgment is that something is inconvenient, unfair, or disappointing. The difference is that accuracy does not demand emotional struggle. It does not insist reality must feel different in order to be acceptable. The pause before assent is not dramatic. It does not require withdrawal or silence. It can be as small as a single breath. A brief recognition, this is an impression. I do not need to decide yet. That pause weakens resistance because resistance feeds on speed and certainty. When assent is withheld, you remain upright. You see clearly. You act if action is appropriate. Or you wait if waiting is reasonable. Either way, you are not dragged. Understanding this mechanism is not enough. Insight alone does not change behavior. The moment must be trained. Why discipline is often misunderstood. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. Discipline is commonly treated as force, as endurance. as the ability to suppress reaction through sheer effort. When this model is applied, standing without resistance feels impossible, because force always creates counterforce. The mind pushes back. Fatigue accumulates. Eventually, restraint collapses. Stoic discipline is not built this way. Discipline, in its original sense, is training. Not punishment. Not tension. Training is quiet, repetitive, and precise. It prepares the mind before pressure arrives. It does not rely on heroics in the moment of stress. Most resistance appears because you ask too much of willpower. You wait until the impression has already taken control, then attempt to overpower it. At that point, discipline feels heavy because it is being used too late. Training works earlier. When you repeatedly practice noticing impressions without immediately assenting to them, the pause becomes familiar. Not dramatic. Familiar. The mind learns that it does not need to decide instantly. This learning happens gradually, through repetition, not through resolve. This is why Stoic discipline does not aim to eliminate emotion. Emotion is part of impression. It arises automatically. Surprise, irritation, attraction, discomfort. None of these are errors. The error is assuming that feeling equals instruction. That sensation must be obeyed. Discipline trains attention, not emotion. You do not say, "I must not feel irritated." You say, "I notice irritation is present." That distinction matters. The first creates internal conflict. The second creates space. In that space, choice becomes possible. Consider how training works in any other domain. A musician does not wait until a performance to learn control. A craftsman does not experiment under pressure. Repetition occurs when stakes are low, so response becomes stable when stakes are high. The same applies here. If you only attempt Stoic restraint when insulted, delayed, or challenged, you will fail often. Not because you lack character, but because you skipped training. Discipline that depends on circumstances cooperating is not discipline. It is luck. This is also why Stoic discipline does not feel aggressive. There is no inner shouting. No internal threat. You are not ordering yourself to behave. You are reminding yourself of what belongs to you. Standing without resistance requires familiarity with the pause. That familiarity is built when nothing dramatic is happening. When you practice noticing small impressions, a minor inconvenience, a fleeting judgment, a brief urge to correct, rush, or react. Each time you notice and withhold assent, you strengthen the habit. The goal is not perfection. It is consistency. You will still assent at times when you did not intend to. You will still feel resistance appear. Discipline is not invalidated by this. The only failure is refusing to observe what happened. Each misstep shows you where training is incomplete. This approach removes self-punishment. Guilt adds another layer of unexamined judgment. It does not improve discipline. It weakens it. Stoic training replaces guilt with clarity. What happened? Where did assent occur? What can be practiced next time? Force asks, "Why can't I control myself?" Training asks, "Where did I agree too quickly?" When discipline is understood as training, standing without resistance stops feeling like suppression. It becomes alignment. Your response aligns with reason rather than impulse. Not because impulse vanished, but because it was not given authority. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life. How practice enters ordinary moments. Discipline lives in what seems insignificant. If Stoic practice only appears during crisis, it will fail you. Training must enter the day quietly, without ceremony. Ordinary moments are where resistance is either reinforced or dissolved. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This does not mean imagining disasters or rehearsing frustration. It means acknowledging, calmly, that impressions will arrive. Delays will occur. People will misunderstand you. Plans will shift. None of this is personal. None of it is exceptional. When you expect uninterrupted comfort, every inconvenience feels like an offense. When you expect impressions, they lose their power to surprise. Anticipation done correctly does not tense the mind. It steadies it. You are not bracing. You are orienting. You might say to yourself in the morning, today, impressions will appear. Some will be pleasant. Some will not. That is enough. No narrative is required. This simple acknowledgement reduces resistance later, because nothing feels abnormal when it happens. The second practice is pausing before assent. This is the core discipline, and it does not need to be elaborate. One breath is sufficient. The pause is not a technique for calming emotion. It is a space for accuracy. An impression arises. The body reacts. A judgment forms. Before agreeing, you pause. You do not argue with the judgment. You do not replace it. You simply delay agreement. This is an impression. I do not need to decide yet. That is the entire practice. In that brief pause, resistance weakens. Not because the situation changed, but because speed was removed. Most inner struggle depends on immediacy. When immediacy is interrupted, clarity enters. Sometimes, after the pause, you may still assent. You may decide the judgment is accurate and action is required. That is not failure. The discipline lies in choosing deliberately, not in choosing passively. The third practice is the evening review, conducted without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you look back briefly. Not to judge yourself, but to observe patterns. Where did assent occur quickly? Where did resistance arise? Where was a pause present? This review must remain factual. Guilt is itself an unexamined judgment. Praise can be just as distracting. Both pull attention away from clarity. The aim is understanding, not evaluation. If you notice that a certain situation consistently triggers resistance, that is not a flaw. It is information. Training becomes more precise when patterns are visible. You do not need to fix everything. You only need to see clearly. These practices are small by design. Stoic discipline does not rely on dramatic interventions. It relies on consistency. The mind is shaped by repetition, not intensity. Notice how none of these practices involve controlling others, managing outcomes, or forcing calm. They all return attention to what is yours: judgment, assent, response. This is why they work. They operate within your authority. Standing without resistance does not mean life becomes smooth. Inconvenience remains. Criticism remains. Uncertainty remains. What changes is your posture. You stop meeting these things with inner opposition. When you no longer argue with reality, energy is conserved. Action becomes cleaner. Speech becomes measured. Silence becomes intentional. You are not rigid. You are aligned. This alignment is not a permanent state. It must be maintained. Each day presents new impressions. Each day requires renewed attention. Discipline is not achieved once. It is practiced repeatedly. Consistency produces a different result. What freedom looks like when resistance ends. Now we can speak precisely about freedom. Freedom, as it is commonly imagined, depends on conditions. Ease, cooperation, approval. When these are present, people feel free. When they disappear, freedom seems to vanish with them. This is not freedom. It is comfort, and comfort is fragile. Stoic freedom remains when conditions do not cooperate. When you no longer resist what is outside your authority, a different kind of stability appears. Life does not become easier. Events still interrupt. People still disagree. Outcomes still disappoint. The difference is internal. You are no longer pulled into conflict with what you cannot command. This is what standing without resistance produces. You continue to act. You correct what can be corrected. You withdraw from what cannot. But you do not argue internally with reality. You do not demand that events justify themselves to your preferences. That demand is what previously exhausted you. Inner freedom begins where authority returns inward. When judgment is reclaimed, you stop needing the world to cooperate in order to remain composed. You stop measuring your state by outcomes. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you accurate. You respond to what is present, not to what you wish were present. Many people confuse freedom with emotional comfort. They believe that if something still bothers them, they are not free. This is a misunderstanding. Feelings are impressions. They arise automatically. Freedom does not require their absence. It requires that they not rule. You may feel irritation and still be free. You may feel disappointment and still be free. You may feel uncertainty and still be free. Freedom lies in not being compelled by these states. When resistance ends, attention sharpens. You notice that much of your previous strain came from arguing internally, replaying conversations, imagining alternatives, resisting timing, resisting limitation. None of this changed events. It only consumed energy. Without resistance, energy returns to action. You speak more deliberately. You act without urgency. You listen without preparing defense. Silence becomes a choice rather than a retreat. This is not passivity. It is command over your own faculty of judgment. This form of freedom must be maintained. It is not secured once and for all. Each new impression invites assent again. Each day presents opportunities to either reclaim authority or surrender it. That is why Stoic freedom is not celebrated as an achievement. It is treated as a responsibility. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. That is the demanding aspect of the discipline. You cannot wait for better circumstances. You cannot postpone responsibility until conditions improve. The work occurs exactly where you are. Standing without resistance does not make you unresponsive. It makes you selective. You respond where reason directs, not where impulse pulls. You choose engagement deliberately. You choose withdrawal deliberately. In both cases, you remain upright. This is why Stoic freedom does not promise relief. It promises sovereignty. Sovereignty over judgment, over assent, over response. These are not abstract ideas. They are operational distinctions applied repeatedly. When this posture stabilizes, you stop asking whether life is fair. You stop measuring progress by emotional comfort. You measure only whether judgment remained yours. Nothing can take this from you unless you grant permission. This brings us to the final responsibility, how responsibility quietly concludes the practice. Nothing here requires escalation. Standing without resistance ends where responsibility is fully accepted. Not as a burden, but as a fact. If disturbance appears, it has not arrived by force. It has entered through judgment. This does not make you guilty. It makes you capable. The final Stoic position is simple. You are not responsible for impressions. You are not responsible for events. You are not responsible for how others behave, decide, or speak. You are responsible for one thing only, whether you grant assent. This responsibility cannot be delegated. It cannot be postponed. And it cannot be softened without being lost. You will not execute this perfectly. There will be days when you assent too quickly. Moments when resistance takes hold before you notice it. This is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that practice is still required. Stoic discipline does not demand flawlessness. It demands honesty. The work ends each day exactly where it began, with judgment. When you notice that you resisted, do not add another judgment on top of it. Do not turn observation into blame. Simply see what occurred. See where agreement was given. See what might be practiced next time. This is enough. Standing without resistance does not make you calm at all times. It makes you accountable at all times. Calm may appear. It may not. Freedom does not depend on that outcome. What remains is ownership. You keep what is yours. You return what is not. The work is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not require approval. It proceeds whether anyone notices or not. Return to the pause. Return to what is yours. Practice this today in something small.